Barbara, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm really excited to have you here.
Thank you so much, Lauren. It's great to be here and to be able to have this conversation with you.
Yes, likewise. Really appreciate your time, really appreciate your willingness to have a conversation. And, here we are in the middle of February. It will be a couple of weeks before we get this podcast released, but we all know that a lot has been going on in the nonprofit sector, executive orders, funding cuts, rescinding and reinstating funding that was cut, so lots of back and forth, probably more back and forth than ups and downs maybe. But I would love to just dive right in, talk with you, someone who is a very well-regarded individual in the nonprofit sector, particularly fundraising, and would love to hear your insights. I know you have been and continue to be involved with some phenomenal organizations, and you're in the DC area. So would love to just start out by getting your pulse, your perspective on what has gone on the last 2 to 3 weeks, what you're seeing with your clients, with other fundraising associations, nonprofit leaders that are service providers, just getting your recap of, where we're at right now, mid-February.
I mean, I think for many of us, our heads are still spinning, but maybe spinning a little bit more slowly than they have been. And it's, I think it's really interesting. The executive orders, the executive orders were extraordinarily unhelpful and unfortunate because of the direct attack on the nonprofit sector. And I will say that just outright, regardless of which, political parties in power, this was an attack on the sector. This is and unnecessarily so. You can call it cost cutting, you can call it trying to improve efficiencies, but the reality is that the nonprofit sector exists because it's filling gaps that the private sector and the government can't fill. So, and it's the third largest employer in the country. I think it's something like 12 million employees work for nonprofits. Think about the power of our foreign assistance. So cutting USAID funding affected 50 countries. So, and that's local NGOs in those countries. So the reality is that it isn't just as simple as we're just going to cut U.S. federal funding to nonprofits, and then problem solved. Of the efficiencies or inefficiencies that are purported. It's much more complicated than that. So if you cut contracts, if you cut funding, you are cutting services, you are affecting lives, you are stopping important scientific research that's happening. And it's going to affect everybody in some way, shape, or form, whether you realize that you are benefiting from the services of a nonprofit or not. So I've seen, particularly in that first week when the executive order first went into effect, we have some clients who were directly affected, and you don't want to hear, well, we can pay our staff for February, and we don't know what happens after that. And this was an organization that was largely funded, received a very big sized federal grant. Another organization said, we don't know how we're going to adapt, but we're doing scenario planning. We're trying to figure this out. We've got some reserves. We're doing some adjustments. And those are, those are exercises that you want organizations to be thinking about in a normal time. But in a time like this, where, maybe a third of their budget is federally funded, maybe they're delivering services and extending reach again because government and private sector can't fulfill. Just extraordinarily unhelpful for nonprofit leaders to have to go through this over and over again, particularly when their funding streams may not be ready for it. And this is not the moment to start to say, well, you probably should be diversifying your revenue. like, it's like saying in the middle of a fire, oh, we probably should have had a smoke alarm. Like, that's not the moment. Uh,
Mhm.
but I think it feels like things are sort of leveling out a little bit, but I know that it will probably pick up again because although the memo was rescinded, the intent was not. And so we're going to see this popping up in organizations having to rethink their work in DEI, their work in immigration and other human services that are going to affect their funding stream. So they may not necessarily, their mission may not necessarily be in the fire in the crosshairs of what this administration said are their values. But if they have any of those buzzwords that are popping up as sort of against this administration, their work is going to be affected in some way.
I think you're raising great points, and I think that's a great summary. You mentioned that some of your clients have been directly affected, and I'm not asking for names, but whether it's some of your clients or just other nonprofits that you're aware of,
Mhm.
what are some of the organizations or industries within the nonprofit that you have seen affected that other people might be surprised by? And I don't say this to scare anyone, but just to inform people of, it might not just be DEI organizations or immigration
Mhm.
organizations. What are some others that you've seen affected already in a quick amount of time that,
Scientific, yeah.
go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Um, Scientific, so science organizations, right? In a whole spectrum of different areas of science. Those who are doing research, conservation organizations, um, some policy organizations, those who
Mhm.
are focused on education,
Yeah.
social justice, which might be maybe a little bit more obvious as kind of anti this administration.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think those are the ones, and of course, international development, which we're seeing particularly most directly affected by the USAID cuts. And I know that there are a lot of staff at large NGOs who are working in the global health space, global development, international development space,
Yeah.
who are getting cut because their USAID funding was cut quite unexpectedly, right? And so now they're out of jobs. Those programs are stopped. That's having a knock-on effect on the local partner who would be the implementing partner usually. So
Mhm.
those are the areas that I'm seeing most especially. And even within um, organizations like universities, for example, they're going through and trying to figure out how do we ensure that the work we're doing continues and fall and is under the radar of
Mhm.
whatever those buzzwords are that are going to get the spotlight of being against the position of this administration.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I was having a conversation, I think just last week, with an organization that they're funded predominantly through county funds,
Mm.
and they focus predominantly on housing
Yeah.
and, housing disparities from, an economic standpoint. And they already have seen, so it goes from federal to state to county funding, and
Yeah.
they're already seeing cuts through all of those levels. And again, this is more focused on housing as well. So, um, yeah, it seems to be pretty much across the board.
Mhm.
And it's very concerning, absolutely. So I know you and I both want to address those concerns today, but I know
Mhm.
we also want to talk about, strategies
Mm.
and be as encouraging as we can, also be as practical as we can, and talk about, what our organizations and service providers and other leaders in the industry, what is the advice, what are the strategies. It's all evolving, undoubtedly, but both, we're wanting to address problems and provide as many solutions as we can
Of course.
today. So earlier you mentioned that you have clients and other nonprofits that are clearly feeling the burden and the impact of the current situation. How
Mhm.
are you seeing organizations navigate through this? Obviously, it's a learning curve, and it's adapting as we go. But for those that, do have at least a month, if not 3 to 6 months of funding, how are you seeing them approach this from an internal standpoint and an external standpoint, maybe communicating with donors?
So I'll speak broadly about that because I've seen this both in the organizations with whom we work, but more broadly across the sector in talking to others, other nonprofit leaders. And I think that in some ways there are similarities to the early days of the pandemic
Mm-hmm.
when there were two camps that I very clearly saw. There were organizations that sort of froze and either didn't know what to do, put their heads in the sand, thought we were going to wait this out, and
Yeah.
got stuck. And
Yeah.
then those who said, all right, we have to figure this out. Let's adapt. Let's communicate. Let's innovate, and let's keep moving forward. And
Yeah.
I very much felt that in the early days of the pandemic, those two very distinct mindsets. And I see it happening again, where there are some organizations who maybe because the majority of their budget is federally funded or gets through grants and contracts, they're sort of they are surprised and uncertain what to do next.
Mm-hmm.
Some may also be thinking, "Oh, this is going to pass," or "The memo has been rescinded. We're okay."
Mm-hmm.
Not okay.
Yeah.
But that's one mindset. So that's very similar to what I saw in early 2020. But I am starting to see, on the other hand, organizations um, approaching the next steps very deliberately. And so they're thinking, all right, let's do our scenario planning. Let's do our cash flow forecasting. Let's see what we have in reserves and how we might offset if that particular grant gets completely cut. How do we offset that? Um, and 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 they are and I see kind of a mix of communication externally. So some are not saying a word because they don't know what to say, and they think that they need to have a really polished answer to say something, which is not true. Others who are saying, all right, we're going to just communicate out saying, we don't know these are the things we're trying to figure out.
Yeah.
We're so grateful that you're by our side. And, what I do also think is happening, which is going to be a little bit different than what we saw in the pandemic, partly because that scenario was different from right now in a number of ways. But there are a lot more resources that are being pushed out for organizations to be thinking about how to protect their organization,
Mm-hmm.
how to counter any attacks that their organization or their issues are facing,
Yeah.
and what are the ways that collectively the sector can regroup and collaborate and rally together. So there's a sort of a growing resistance movement, I think. I hope will continue, where everyone's saying we're in this together and let's ensure that we are protecting each other as much as we can.
Right.
I also think that there's funders. Funders are interesting. I haven't seen a massive change yet in
Mm-hmm.
how they're thinking about their own funding. I'm thinking more especially about institutional funders,
Yeah.
how they might change their funding. We definitely saw this in 2020 with the pandemic, with the overdue calls for social justice, where foundations and corporate foundations were saying, okay, we're going to change in these ways. We're going to start to double down in these areas.
Yeah.
I haven't quite seen that yet. And so I think it'll be a really interesting year to watch, especially for individuals, and
Mm-hmm.
how individuals might change their funding, their philanthropy, how donor advised fund grants might change,
Right.
and if we will see any noticeable movement in the institutional funders to partner with their grantees in a different way in light of all these extraordinary stresses that they're feeling.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. All great points. I feel like we could sit here for 3+ hours and
Well,
probably talk about just that little bit.
yeah.
But yes, like you said, I think that, I mean, with any challenge or crisis, it is always really amazing to see how resilient people and communities and industries can be,
Mhm.
and to see people rally together, to see organizations work together, to see individual and institutional, but like you said, individuals will just by nature be able to more quickly pivot and change,
Mhm.
and to see how individual donors, family foundations,
Yeah.
and others, corporate
Mhm.
partners, how they pivot. And I believe that we'll see more engagement. I think we'll see more support from some of those individuals or even institutions at some point, because there's clearly a need for more support, and there's clearly a need to step up and take action. And so I think that's one of the beautiful things, despite the challenges and the hardships, is how we can support each other, just emotionally and in a community standpoint, but also monetarily as well. So it will. I agree. I agree that it will be interesting to see how things pivot and how things shift. But as things are very early right now, it's a little bit hard to know exactly what that's going to look like.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, for sure.
absolutely. What are some of the strategies that you're recommending to your clients right now? What are some of the things that you're seeing? I actually want to pause and backtrack. You mentioned that you have some resources and some things that you would advise nonprofits to look at, to go to. What might some of those be? We can mention them here and then put them in the show notes as well.
Yeah, and I'll make sure you get them so you can put them in the show notes.
Okay.
So the first is the Council of Nonprofits. They, since, well, I guess week one of this administration, they have been tracking all of the executive orders,
Mhm.
and they have been adding to it and updating it almost on a daily basis, saying, okay, this executive order, this is what the impact might be for the nonprofit sector.
Yeah.
They have on their website, they've got an incredible amount of other links and hyperlinks for guidance and advice. They just did a webinar, I think it was earlier this week, but they've got a link to the recording of the webinar as well. So that's worth checking out. And again, I'll make sure you have these so you can put them in the show notes.
Yes.
The other is another organization called Boulder Advocacy, and they have in a ton of resources for organizations around how to do like a self-assessment to ensure, particularly around compliance and risk management.
Yeah.
Do they have their all of their ducks in a row, all their I's dotted, their T's crossed, so that should their particular organization directly come under attack for different things, and there are lots
Mhm.
of areas around, that could happen, like investigations for that are unfounded,
Mhm.
um, or social media attacks and things like that.
Right.
So this gives a whole list of things that the organizations should be thinking about and ensuring that they've got in place. So those, I'll make sure you have so you can put those there. I would absolutely encourage nonprofit leaders to be checking them regularly because um, information is going to be power here. So
Right.
you want to ensure that your organization is as protected as possible,
Mhm.
and that you, as leaders, are as informed as possible to understand and try to make sense of all of this.
Right.
Um, the other thing I would say, though, we have really been encouraging, and I've been doing this in LinkedIn, and I've been doing this with our clients, really encouraging organizations to be first and foremost, in addition to the internal steps of like making sure that they get their footing on solid ground, understand where their risks are going to be and what they might need to do about that,
Right.
is communicating. And we saw this in the pandemic when the organizations who were more regularly communicating, who were kind of keeping as much as business as usual as they could,
Mhm.
actually emerged out of the pandemic a little bit better and a little stronger than the organizations that stopped everything and said, we're not going to talk to anyone because we don't want to bother them. This isn't not the right time.
Right.
So we've really been encouraging our organizations, and I've been doing it more broadly through my LinkedIn posts, to say, you just got to send something out in the moment of, the first executive order that, or the one that cut all of the funding, uh,
Mm-hmm.
or paused, I should say, all of the funding. Say to your donors, we don't know what's going on, but this is how it's affecting us, and these are the
Mm-hmm.
steps we are going to try to take. We're going to
Right.
keep you posted. That's all donors need to hear.
Yeah.
Um, and then maybe some regular updates, because here's the thing: if the donors see that your organization is being affected in an unplanned way, in a very detrimental way,
Mm-hmm.
they will probably want to say, how can I help? So
Right.
you want to allow them that opportunity to be helping, and to be part of the to be an ally as you move forward through these difficult times, because
Mm-hmm.
they're choosing your organization because it's solving a problem that they care about as well.
Right.
And the messages don't have to be super polished. They don't have to be political. They don't have to be anything more than, we don't know.
Yeah.
I don't want to have to hear from my staff, will I get paid this month?
Right.
But these are the things we're trying to figure out, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And we're so grateful that you, our audience, our subscribers, our members, our donors, are by our side. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
And then, maybe another update, as things progress. But that has to, because your donors will hear everything they're hearing and watching the news, as we all are, and especially for nonprofit leaders.
Mm-hmm.
They may not know, they may not connect the dots, especially as we were talking at the beginning, like those
Yeah.
missions that are the surprises, the ones that we don't expect, or we're not seeing kind of in the headlines.
Right.
So that's important for those donors to say, oh, wait a minute, hang on, you're being affected right now?
Right.
Wow. Okay, I didn't realize that. The obvious ones, yeah, we get it, but that's still, that I'm not minimizing that at all.
No.
But that messaging still has to happen, and it can be through an email blast. It could be through a short webinar, or mini town hall with a
Mm-hmm.
CEO or AD.
Yeah.
It could be periodic updates, video updates. That's it. It doesn't have to be super fancy or polished, but just opening the lines of communication to say, we are in this together, and we couldn't do this without you.
Right. Yeah. No, I completely agree with that. And I think that's all great advice. I think what we've seen is some leaders who are hesitant to communicate, as you said,
Yeah.
because, what do we communicate? We don't know.
Mhm.
And that's understandable. But I also think that quite a few are hesitant to communicate with particularly their donor base, because they don't want to get political, and they don't have a political mission. And to your point, like you said at the beginning of the conversation, it doesn't have to be political. Yes, it is
Mhm.
about politics,
Uh-huh.
but the reality is, if it's affecting your organization, or if you think in the future it will likely affect your organization, then it is worth communicating. And it's a great way to re-engage your audience again, whether it's community members, whether it's donors. We all have, our inboxes are flooded and our brains are in a million places. And so
Yeah.
for those who may not be overly engaged with your mission, you can segment your donor list, your email list, and
Mhm.
communicate with really engaged donors more in depth than you would with those that aren't overly engaged. But we all need reminders and calls to action.
Yeah.
And, so this is a great time to just, like you're saying, inform people, even if you don't know exactly what your plan is or what you're informing them of, and reminding them that this is what your mission is about. This is how we foresee some of these changes affecting our
Mhm.
mission. And like you said, we couldn't do what we've already done without you. And we definitely can't do this over the long term without you, if we're losing other funding and support systems. So yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's all really, really fantastic advice.
Thank you. Yeah. And, we can't lose sight of facts. So, um, so we have to, it is a fact that funding was cut, through an executive order for all nonprofits. That's a fact. That's not a political statement. That is, this happened regardless of how anybody voted. So if organizations are hesitant to get to seem too political, they have to remember that there's ways to phrase the language so
Mhm.
that it is again keeping it at that surface of these are the facts. There are some that will want to become, because they're more they are maybe more advocacy focused, or their positioning has always been a little bit more forward and direct, and they may want to put a more political spin on it, and that's up to them. Their audience is going to will be aware of that anyway. So, but these are facts that we are dealing with, and cutting. For international NGOs who have now been deeply affected by the USAID cuts of the entire all global development,
Mhm.
that's a fact, right? So
Mhm.
again, it doesn't matter which side of the aisle you might be on.
Yeah.
It directly is affecting lives, both people who have now lost their jobs and people who around the world whom we will never know, who are no longer going to get those services and
Right.
health programs that are being funded by USAID.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm with you on that. Just being more data driven, I think sticking to facts is beneficial for a lot of
Yeah,
reasons. And so
yeah,
we're probably both a little bit biased in that regard. But I think in this situation, it serves people well to stay informed and to stick with, facts.
yeah.
Unless, like you said, if you do have more of a political advocacy group or policy group,
Mhm.
then be as political as you would like
Yeah,
to be.
exactly.
Um, but you mentioned that seeing how things panned out in 2020 for a lot of organizations and those that did take action earlier, particularly on the communication side, and
Mhm,
really pushed through to keep operations as normal as possible, at least tended to fare better.
mhm.
What are some differences that you might be seeing or that you did see with COVID that might pertain here as well? As far as organization size, I think a lot of smaller nonprofit leaders think, oh, well, that organization was able to survive COVID or another crisis, the 2007, 2008
Yeah.
economic crisis. I think a lot of people think, well, that was because they were a larger organization.
Mhm,
That was because they were a more established organization, or vice versa.
mhm,
Larger organizations might think, well, they were, smaller to mid-size, and so they were more flexible, more facile, more.
mhm.
So, just what's your perspective there on size of organization, duration of how long they've been around? Any differences or discrepancies or similarities that you're seeing there?
I think it's a really interesting question. I think there's um, I wish we had a crystal ball to be able to determine who will be most affected when we get through all of this.
Yeah.
Um, Ironically, during the pandemic, um, we actually saw nonprofit growth at the end of it.
Mhm.
So while there were quite a number of nonprofits that of different sizes, but mostly small to medium, that actually had to close or merge,
Yeah.
it was countered by a far greater number of nonprofits that were started. So it became kind of a net positive at the end of it, which was really kind of ironic. Um, I don't. I think I think it's the smaller ones. The smaller to mid-size are the ones that will probably, again, especially if they're in, as we were talking about at the beginning, people don't realize that the federal funding can go to the state, can
Mhm.
go to the county,
Yeah.
local, right?
Yeah.
So I think that they're going to be the ones who will, um, of course, be most compromised. Um, my sense is, though, that it's the mid-sized organizations that are the most nimble,
Mhm.
because small to mid-size are just generally operating on very thin margins to begin with.
Yeah.
We saw this in 2020 when most didn't even have, had barely had 3 months of reserves. I think over the last number of years, maybe that has improved a little bit, maybe to 6 months.
Yeah.
Um, I think that mid-sized organizations are the ones who probably have the the financial resources and the flexibility to be a little bit more nimble. The smaller nonprofits, you would think, are going to be more nimble because they're smaller and they can be a little bit more adaptable, but the mindset isn't always there because they don't have the financial resources to feel like they can be in a growth mindset,
Mhm.
which I feel like directly correlates between the two. So I, I, I I'm curious though about the larger ones, because they are the ones who also are most directly affected by the AID cuts, by a lot of the federal funding, particularly around research, and other grants, and contracts.
Right.
So I'm not sure. I think the most important thing is to be is to not to be so dizzy from the constantly changing EOs, and to pause, look at what the resources are that are out there to help interpret this, understand how you can steady your own organization, and um, and lean on your partners. So this is, we talked about earlier about communicating. I forgot to mention, the organizations need to be also communicating with any of their larger funders, like their corporate partners, their foundation partners. Those are one-on-one conversations,
Right.
to ensure that that they are fully briefed on what's happening. So I think I'm probably not answering your question entirely, but there's if an organization can have the presence of mind to not get caught up in the constant whiplash that we're all facing.
Mhm.
And if the team, the executive team, the leadership team can collectively understand what their data is, right? What are their resources? What are the exercises that they need to be doing internally to understand how do we weather through this?
Right.
Um, and then think about, okay, if we lost that funding, what would this mean for our organization? How do we adapt?
Mhm.
um, at least in the short term. It's those leadership moments, and decisions that will carry the organization through, frankly, regardless of the size of the organization.
Right.
I mean, we do this as business owners, right? We're always thinking about our forecasting and how do we add or subtract or adapt, depending on what our market is. And,
Mhm.
this is very applicable to what nonprofit leaders need to be thinking about right now.
Right. I agree. Yes, clearly, for profits and nonprofits are different, for good reason,
Yeah.
and it
Yep.
should remain that way. While at the same time, I think that we can both learn from one another, for profits and nonprofits. And in a situation like this, I agree that
Mhm.
um, more nimble, shorter feedback loops,
Yeah.
as far as data and finances and where things are at, are much more helpful. And then, like you mentioned, having multiple staff members, but especially leadership being, very willing to pivot and make it work and try something different or new, given the situation, I think is critical to adapting no matter what the situation might be.
Mhm.
Um,
And adapting also means, what are we willing to pause on or get rid
mhm.
of,
Yep.
right? And we as a sector don't like that question,
Yeah.
because every organization, regardless of size, small, medium, large, have their programs, and those are the programs that define who they are and what their impact is.
Hmm.
But what I was certainly advocating for a lot during the pandemic was, what do you need to pause? What do you need to do differently? What do you need to get rid of?
Right.
And those questions, again, good practice generally, but in a moment like this, especially if an organization's, if the majority of their funding is coming from a source that they should have or mostly counted on, right?
Hmm.
Education funding, for example, whoever thought that that would ever be under jeopardy? So,
Right.
so thinking about, okay, what do we need to pause? What no longer will be in our best interest for an ROI purpose, and what do we need to just get rid of completely? And then are the things that you're doing are there other ways maybe to cut costs, to do it differently, to be
Yeah.
as effective, or mostly as effective? So I
Yeah.
think we have to allow for that space to say, are there things that we need to just stop temporarily or stop completely?
Mhm.
Um, and that's okay, right? Like it's
Right.
part of our evolution as organizations.
Yeah, exactly. And I won't get on a total soapbox, but at Social Impact Solutions, we're clearly very big on measuring your impact
Yeah.
through data-driven and evidence-based approaches. And so this is a time where I think if you have, and a lot of organizations don't have their impact data at all, or at least not very much of it. But for those that do have impact data,
Hmm.
I think this is a critical time to use that information in a way that you're speaking to,
Yeah.
and what should we cut? What can we sometimes it might come down to just you have to cut it whether you want to or not, and
Yeah.
we realize that. But ideally, if you can look at, well, what programs are most effective and impactful? What programs are most needed by our community members? So if you've done a needs assessment lately, if you've collected impact data and you've done some program evaluations, using that data to help you determine what's most helpful to our constituents. Yes, the organization has to look at funding as well, and we all know that. But just taking the two and pairing them together and saying, well, what's most effective and what's impactful, and what programs or what aspects of programs have we maybe created and have evolved over the years that feel good to us internally, or maybe feel good to our donors, or maybe feel good to our volunteers, but it's just not the most helpful
Yeah.
or impactful aspect of what we do for who we serve. So I know this is more of a fundraising conversation, so I won't talk about that too much, but
But no, it's important. It's exactly the kinds of questions that organizations, especially now, need to be thinking about because,
yeah,
as they're doing their scenario planning, and again, those don't have to be extraordinarily in depth, but
right,
it's really kind of putting on a whiteboard, whether it's like on a wall or on your computer screen, what are the possible routes that an organization might have to go down,
right,
and you map out and looking at all the impact data that they have. Hopefully they have enough to say, okay, this is what we could operate at 85% of our
yeah,
programs by
yeah,
doing these, or okay, we have
right,
to cut by this much. And I think that those are just solid questions that organizations need to be thinking through, uh,
mhm,
especially now because you know, there's U.S. Federal funds are about a third of funding to the sector, so
yeah,
it's not insignificant.
no, no,
And at the smaller mid-size, it's though that can make or break an organization.
mhm, right. Exactly. So, along those lines, and thinking a little bit outside of the box, earlier you mentioned, again, we keep going back to COVID. I know it's
Yeah.
2025, but
Yep.
it's just our most current crisis that we might be able to compare to. So,
Yeah.
um, you mentioned, some organizations were able to merge and survive.
Mhm.
We also very briefly touched on going to partners, corporate partners. What are some outside of the box creative ways that you think organizations can partner together or can go to their local community and talk to business owners, corporate partners that they maybe haven't secured yet?
Mhm.
But just what are some outside of the box ways that you are already seeing or in the past have seen, or maybe just ideas that you have that you would like to see on how we can, support one another, how nonprofits can support other nonprofits and not be cutthroat and competitive, even though funding is getting more competitive.
Mhm.
How can local communities work together? And by that, I mean all stakeholders involved: donors, volunteers, corporate
Mhm.
partners. Any outside of the box thoughts or strategies there?
Um, I think probably the biggest one that I hope the sector can embrace more is the opportunity for collaboration.
Hmm.
Um, there, there's what I think the latest number is 1.4 million nonprofits in the US, 1.2, 1.4. And yes, there's a lot of overlap. Especially in certain communities. And so I would love for organizations, this seems very simple, but in a lot of ways, it is an out of the box approach because it is counterintuitive to nonprofit thinking. Nonprofits have their mission, they've got their programs, and they are focused on raising money for that. And, they might look at who their peers are, / competitors doing similar work, who's getting funding, what are their programs, and how do we differentiate ourselves from those programs. That's all fine. But in a moment like this, is there value? Can there be value in leveraging pooled resources, pooled expertise, pooled footprint? And so I don't see that enough. I'm not optimistic it's going to happen during this round of crisis, but I'm hopeful because if anything, I think this is, I am starting to see organizations sort of at least support each other, and maybe emotionally in we're in this together. And this sector is extraordinarily resilient. So I know, I believe that the sector will emerge out of all of this chaos, and will be stronger.
Yeah.
We did it before. We've done it many times. I just hope that there is a more openness, a greater openness to partnership and collaboration. We've seen this from time to time in some, particularly in cities where different funders have said, "Oh, we're issuing as RFP for a grant, and it requires nonprofits to partner and collaborate on a proposal."
Yeah.
Great, but you're forcing that in a way that wouldn't normally have happened. So we create more opportunities at local levels for funders, for funders and for nonprofits to find those alliances and allegiances in a way that will maximize impact, especially if federal funding, local, sort of state, local funding is cut. And how can they then pool their resources together to really address the most immediate needs within their communities?
Right. I love that. We're huge collaborators and love to collaborate and partner with others like Windmill Hill Consulting
Yeah.
or whomever it might be. So we see this in the for-profit sector too, that some are very willing to collaborate and others not as much. But it's a little bit surprising, even though it's well known. But yeah, a lot of nonprofits don't collaborate and are, in fact, concerned to collaborate, because, well, they're going to get the funding or they're going to get more of the funding. And collaboration is not always the answer, but more often than not, partnering together and being able to niche down and still do more, I think allows for an organization or an individual or teams to do what they're best at and to do more of it and to do it more efficiently and effectively. Um, but you don't have to cut this part of what you were already doing. You're just outsourcing it or partnering and collaborating with another, even for profit in your community, but another nonprofit would be fantastic. So I think that's great advice. And I hear what you're saying that, now might not be the time that those shifts and mindset changes occur, but if and when they do, I think it's really beneficial for entire organizations and institutions, and community benefit as well.
Yeah. And and funders love it. They want to see,
Yeah.
especially if it's for whatever issue it is that they want to fund in their communities, they love seeing ways to leverage their grants
Right.
in a collaborative way. So um there's that. So nonprofits have to, um shouldn't look at it as we're going to lose a piece of the pie, because if anything, they might actually get more than they would have previously asked for,
Right.
or been granted.
Right.
But the collaboration also needs to happen internally within organization. I see this especially with mid to larger size nonprofits where there may not be where there's internal silos or key relationship holders who
Right.
are, not necessarily in the development office. And so those internal silos have to be broken down as well.
Mhm.
Again, for the betterment of the organization as a whole, but those silos exist both outside nonprofit to nonprofit and internally sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think we could schedule another conversation and talk about just internal silos.
Yeah, for sure.
And it happens all the time. And I don't think typically I don't think it's ill intended,
No.
but
Yeah.
it does lead to so many challenges. Whether it's fundraising on the impact measurement side, we're typically working with development and operations and oftentimes marketing and communications as well. And so,
Yeah.
working with multiple departments, you see a lot of those silos and where the breakdown uh, is occurring. And so I completely agree that being as collaborative as possible, whether that's from department to department or organization to organization, uh, all around typically leads to much better results for everyone and just overall expanded reach, expanded impact, and like you're saying, more interest, engagement, and investment from funders. So,
Yeah.
yeah, we might have to schedule a follow up call to talk more about silos and breaking down those barriers. But this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate your insights, and I know that our listeners will too.
Thank
As
you.
we wrap up here, any final words of encouragement, any final thoughts, or other resources that you wanted to share?
I want nonprofit leaders, and anyone who works in a nonprofit to just realize how important their work is.
Mhm.
And so in moments or times like this where everything feels so heavy and it feels like you're, kind of climbing up the hill with the headwinds right at you, you're not alone. And and this sector needs you as
Yeah,
leaders and as nonprofit staff. So keep the work going and know that there are so many other resources out there because we will get through all of this together.
yeah,
And that's not a platitude. That is very much a truth that we are in this together as a sector, and as the whole sector is under attack. We will, if we rise together and band together, we will get through it.
yeah,
Our communities need us, so don't lose hope. There are many resources out there. There are many, support networks, and we've got each other as nonprofit leaders. So just keep leaning on leaders at other peer organizations and and our funders as well, donors and
mhm,
funders.
yeah. Absolutely. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Barbara. I know this is a timely conversation and things will continue to evolve, but I really appreciate your insights and I know that others will be able to learn a lot from it. So, for those listening, you can find Barbara at Windmill Hill Consulting at her website or on LinkedIn. Barbara has a lot of great content on LinkedIn. It's Barbara O'Reilly and I think your comma CFRE
Mm.
if people are looking for you on LinkedIn. So thank you so much, Barbara. It's been a great conversation.
Oh, thanks so much, Lauren. I so enjoyed having this conversation with you.
Likewise.